Around the end of August or the beginning of September in the year 1665, a box arrived for Alexander Hadfield, a tailor who lived in the village of Eyam with his wife, Mary, née Moseley, their children, and a lodger named George Vickers. George was either a servant who had been hired by Mary after her first husband's death had left her relatively wealthy, or he was an assistant tailor to Alexander. Whatever the case, he opened the box and, noting that the clothes inside were damp, laid them out to dry by the fire. He fell ill soon after, and on the 7th of September he became the first of many in Eyam who would be buried on account of the plague over the next 14 months. On the 22nd of September, the next victim was buried, Edward Cooper, the son of Mary and her deceased first husband. Peter Hawkesworth, Thomas Thorpe, Mary Thorpe, and Sarah Siddle, all close neighbours to the Coopers, were buried by the 30th. Fear and panic spread through the village. It was recalled that earlier that year, some boys had let cows into the church that had fouled the nave. They wondered if this had invoked God's wrath against them. Many fled, but not everyone could simply run away. The rich could certainly leave, but everyone else couldn't just abandon their mines, lands, farms, and the other means by which they made their living, although some did send their children away to live with relatives or friends. Those who didn't leave were to see 23 more funerals in October. The villagers waited hopefully for the winter months. Plague is a summer disease, and with winter around the corner, their misery would soon be over, or so they thought. In the roofs of their homes, rats lived out the winter in relative warmth, carrying the disease with them and allowing it to survive. Although the death rate dropped over winter and seemed to stay low throughout May, it was to return with renewed potency in June. Between the death of George Vickers and the beginning of June, 62 had died. By the end of June, 77 more were dead, bringing the total up to 139. More chose to flee or send their children away at this point. The village rector, William Mompesson, chose to stay despite his wife's protests, and his wife decided to stay with him, but they sent their children to live with friends in Yorkshire. Waiting until winter had failed, and Mompesson decided, in the absence of the squire and the wealthier residents who would usually lead the villagers, to take his own action. But he didn't do this alone. Here, a little more background of the internal politics of Eyam is required. William Mompesson was the village rector. However, he had only been in Eyam since 1664, and at 28 years old he would have been considered a youngster in the village. On top of this, one of his predecessors, the older Thomas Stanley, still lived in Eyam. Stanley had been present in Eyam since 1644, when the Puritans had ousted his predecessor, Shawland Adams, and replaced him with Stanley, who was a Puritan. Stanley was removed himself in 1660 and replaced with Adams once again, although Stanley was likely still the priest in charge in Eyam, as Adams spent little time there due to having more than one living. Stanley and Adams were virulently opposed to each other's religious beliefs, and between 1660 to 62, the village would have formed factions with some backing Adams' conformist Anglicanism and some backing Stanley's Puritanism. Eventually, on St. Bartholomew's Day in 1662, Stanley was one of thousands of priests who resigned their living, and he left Eyam in protest of the Act of Uniformity in 1661 and the Book of Common Prayer in 1662. This didn't last long, however. When Mompesson became rector in 1664, Stanley returned despite acts of Parliament forbidding dissenting clergy from returning to their old parishes. He may have returned due to Adam's death, or possibly just because after his wife had died, he wanted to be amongst the people that he had known for a good portion of his life. Either way, Stanley had returned to Eyam, and he was a figure of religious authority who had known the villagers there for at least the past 2 decades. Although Stanley would certainly have disagreed with Mompesson's religious views, the animosity that had existed between Stanley and Adams was not inherited by Mompesson, and Stanley was exactly who Mompesson needed to help him unite the village behind him. The two put aside their religious differences and moved forwards together. After meeting with each other several times, they came up with a plan. The fact that the two worked in unison was likely the reason that their plan succeeded. They called the village together, probably at a public assembly, and 3 decisions were made. Firstly, from that point on, no more organised funerals or churchyard burials would be held. Too many were dying to cope with them, and it was felt that the clergy better spent their time looking after the bereaved, the dying, and the sick, as well as preparing wills. Besides, it was agreed that it was important that the dead were buried quickly to prevent the further spread of the plague. The village agreed that people would bury their own dead from then on, which they did in gardens, orchards, and fields. Secondly, it was decided that from then on church services would be held in the open air at Cucklet Delph, in order to avoid spreading the plague further by packing everyone into the church. Everyone was to stay 12 feet from their neighbours and any strangers. Finally, a boundary was imposed around the village to stop anyone from spreading the plague outside into the communities around Eyam, the villages, or, significantly, the city of Sheffield. The villagers consented to all of those decisions. There was, however, one further issue that needed to be addressed. The village was not self-sufficient, and it was unable to feed itself with outside help. This was provided by the Earl of Devonshire, who lived in nearby Chatsworth House. The Earl sent them both food and any medical supplies he could obtain at his own expense, leaving them at Eyam's southern boundary. Supplies were also sent from Fulwood and left at a place now called Mompesson's Well, and another, more distant ancient stone circle at Wet Withens. The neighbouring village Bubnall also helped to provide bread to Eyam. Additional supplies from the Earl could be requested at the boundary stone, where they were paid for by coins placed in vinegar left in holes drilled into the rock. All of this was successful in preventing the spread of plague outside the village. We only know of 2 cases of people escaping the village after this point, and no deaths were recorded in the areas surrounding the parish. Inside Eyam, however, is another case entirely. In July, the first whole month after the village's agreement, there were 56 deaths, and in August, 78 died. This included Catherine Mompesson, who had spent vast amounts of time tending to the sick. It is said that one day in August, she noted how sweet the air smells. Her husband noted this with alarm as a symptom of the plague, and she died a few days later. By this point, 217 had died. This was a lot of deaths for a village of around 690 people pre-plague. After this, the death rate began to decline. In September, there were 24, and in October, the final month of the plague outbreak, only 14 died. Eyam had suffered through the plague and saved the surrounding countryside from it, but they had also lost a large percentage of their population. The survivors had little reason to celebrate. They were surrounded by the graves of their neighbours, friends, colleagues, and families. Entire households had been completely destroyed. Some people, like Mary Mosley, were the sole survivors of their households, left alone in an empty house where a year before they had lived with their spouses and children. The news of each death would have followed so quickly after each other, it would have left them little time to mourn, especially at the height of the plague in August. As morbid as the mood was, by Christmas life began to return to some degree of normality. Refugees returned and neighbours reconnected. The sounds of the village made a comeback as children played on the streets once more. However, there were still fears that the plague would return after winter like it had the previous year. To prevent this, the villagers buried or burned anything they thought might be contaminated. After the ritual cleansing, they slowly began to rebuild their lives. This included Matthew Morton and Sarah Furness, whose spouses had both died in the plague. It is said that one day Morton was walking his dog along the hillside when it ran up to Sarah, who was walking towards them, supposedly believing her to be its dead mistress having returned. It is recorded in the parish register that Sarah and Matthew married in October 1667. They were not the only ones who remarried. Mary Mosley married for a 3rd time to John Coe. Marshall Howe, who had survived the plague, married a Mary Hadfield, who may have been the cousin of Alexander Hadfield, the tailor whose house the plague had found its first victim in. Thomas Stanley also survived the plague and died 4 years later in Eyam in 1670. Mompesson, the young rector who had lost his wife in the late 20s, was left depressed and distraught over her death, but he managed to keep supporting the villagers until the plague was over. He remarried in 1670 to Elizabeth Newby and moved to a new living in Eakring near Newark. There, he encountered problems as the local church was almost ruinous, and he requested financial assistance to repair it. Whilst the repairs were taking place, he is said to have conducted services by an ash tree on a hillock outside the village. He was made a prebendary canon of Southwell and a prebend of York, but he refused further honours that were offered to him, including the deanery of Lincoln. He eventually died in 1708. If you enjoyed this video, leave a like and a comment, and subscribe for future content.